Hey everybody. So last night in our Bible study class, we were looking at this passage from Exodus 1, and I was explaining to the group how, as you see here in the middle, the story tends to turn around this phrase that the ESV translates for they are vigorous, speaking of the Hebrew women, how they were different than the Egyptian women. In that they give birth before the midwife comes to them. And I didn't really get a chance to explain really how in this story, and this is really the big question, how did these midwives appease Pharaoh? They're under interrogation here, and somehow they get off and end up becoming very blessed by God for this act of bravery and civil disobedience that they went through. And part of the problem here is that this phrase "for they are vigorous," it is an accurate translation grammatically, but that is not going to appease Pharaoh. So what's going on? That's the question. And in our group time, I didn't really get a chance to explain what was going on here as to how the midwives got away with this. So I thought I would take a few minutes and explain in a video what's going on. So in order to do that, I wanted to show you my translation of this passage, and in which generally when I translate, I try to keep the translation as literal as possible. Any repetition and things like that, I want to show those repetitions and the literal nature of it just for study purposes. It may not read as well in English, but sometimes we see the symbolism and the word plays and figures of speech a little more clearly. So again, when you get to verse 19, we get to this passage, and the other thing I'm doing in this, if you read starting, because not like the women of Egypt are the Hebrew women, and then so that's the word order in the Hebrew, or the basic word order, because not like the women of Egypt are the Hebrew women, and then this phrase in question, ki chayot hena. So what does that mean? And in fact, it actually has at least 3 different ways that phrase could legitimately be translated. And then again, you get this phrase that comes after it. Before the midwife comes to them, they give birth. And so what is going on here? Well, we've got multiple meanings. And so the issue is, I think the women are telling Pharaoh something in a way that they think he's going to hear what he wants to hear, or they're playing to his biases, when in fact they're saying or meaning something opposite. So there's a little bit of irony going on here, as well as sarcasm. So let's take a look and see what these possible meanings are. All right, so this first word, ki, is a particle in the Hebrew, and sometimes ki can be an article that introduces an explanatory clause, and it's often translated for. But it can also introduce a comparison clause or phrase, and in that case, it would be translated like. So it's kind of a flexible relative particle that has a range of uses and meanings. And then the next word in the phrase here, chayot, that's an adjective. It's feminine plural, and it's rooted in the word chai, which means life or living. And as an adjective, it would be lively, or describing the liveliness of something. And then hena, that's a feminine plural form of the pronoun they. It's third person, so they, referring to feminine characters, and in this case it's the Hebrew women. So we've got these three words to deal with. And so this idea, the question comes then, well, what is the key functioning? How is it functioning as in this phrase? Well, this is when you you go to the commentaries. And certainly you get a range of opinion, and you get some pretty interesting conclusions, and I've got them listed here. So one of the options, and this is similar to where the ESV goes, but really I like, instead of saying for they are vigorous, which has the same idea, but since the word in Hebrew chaya is so similar to the noun chai, which means to be alive, in your commentaries and probably in several translations, it would say something like, for they are lively. So the key is being translated as for. They is in all the options, that's basically the same. And then they're treating hayot as a predicate adjective, lively, describing the Hebrew women. Well, interestingly as well, because of this hayot, living things are animals, right? Not necessarily the plant world, but human beings are animals in a sense. So the Hebrew women could have been saying something like, for they are animals. Now that's getting a little bit closer to something it's obviously could be taken in a derogatory sense. And so if Pharaoh hears something like that, these Hebrew women, they're not like the Egyptian women, for they're animals. The Hebrew women are animals. Well, Pharaoh, he's already prejudiced against these Hebrews, and when he hears something like that, which is technically true, but yet it may be spoken in a derogatory sense, he might be inclined to take these midwives at their word. Okay. Now, if you take the key as a comparison particle, introducing a comparison, then two could be rephrased here as number three, and it would just simply be, they are like animals, or they're like creatures of the earth. They're lower beings than the Egyptian women are. Again, very derogatory, but yet technically true. All right, so all three of these options would be a legitimate translation. And so we're kind of left in a quandary. Well, which one is the right translation? Well, it goes back to meaning. All translation requires some interpretation, and so what do you do when you're forced to take something in one language and render it one way in another language? Clearly, there's wordplay involved here, or the double entendre, the double meaning. And so when it comes to the spoken word, the meaning often comes not so much in what you say, but how you say it. I believe that the midwives spoke to Pharaoh in such a way that they sounded like they were ridiculing the Hebrew women. And just as a matter of point here, there's a lot of discussion whether Shiphrah and Puah were Egyptians or whether they were Hebrews. Their names, especially Puah, is very similar. It's found in records for Egyptian women. So in other documents, that name has appeared. It could also have a Semitic root to it, as well as Shiphrah. So there's debate as to whether these midwives were Egyptians or Hebrews. So again, that could lend to, if they were Egyptian midwives, Pharaoh might be inclined to believe them when they're describing these Hebrew mothers as animals. Okay, so Pharaoh, when he hears something that sounds like ridicule, it's going to just confirm what he already believes. Okay, but yet in one sense, I believe that these women were actually speaking a profound practical and theological truth that pointed to their honor, okay, the Hebrew women. And thus you get the double entendre through the use of irony and or sarcasm. And again, just to define the terms, irony is saying the exact opposite of what you mean, and often that's done with a sarcastic tone. So if I said something like, "Oh yeah, you're a real genius," okay, obviously by my tone, you should be able to tell that I actually mean that whoever I'm speaking to is not a genius, but actually ignorant or stupid. Okay, well that would be irony. And so the question becomes, well, what did these women who feared God, the author tells us that twice, these women feared God, and that's what led them to disobey the Pharaoh. So what did they mean by what they said? Again, there's a little bit of wordplay here. So when they said, this is how I would translate it, to make the story make sense, to actually show that the women got off the hook. I would translate it, they're like animals. But in their minds, because they feared the living creator God, my computer has a spirit here. But in their minds, because they feared the living creator God, what they were really meaning is they are like Eves. Okay, well, why do I say Eves here? Well, it's a wordplay. And the biblical authors, just like every great writer, they love to use literary forms and features or rhetorical, oratory forms, and wordplay is certainly one of them. So this wordplay, if we go to Genesis 20, Eve, who is the mother of all living, that's why her name is called Eve. We see there in Genesis 3:20, it says the man called his wife's name Eve. Or in the Hebrew, it sounds something like Chava, because she was the mother of all Chai. And Chai, again, is the noun form of Chaya, the adjective, which means life or living. Okay, so Eve's name sounds like the word for life. And so the Hebrew women were like Eve, who, like wild animals do, it gave birth to her sons without any assistance of a midwife. All right, so Eve, obviously being the first mother, she's giving birth without the help of a midwife. Well, in a technical sense, a literal sense, that's what wild animals do. They just give birth with no help. Not even like a farm animal, a cow or a horse or a sheep. When they're giving birth in the stable, quite oftentimes the shepherd or the farmer comes in and helps that animal to deliver the foal or the lamb. So a huge degree of irony, but yet again there's this profound truth that's setting the stage for the rest of the story that these Hebrew women, if we go back and now look at our passage again, if you notice here, in terms of civilization, the women of Egypt would be the highest women of any society. Egypt was extremely wealthy and powerful at this time in history. And so the women of Egypt would be the most civilized. They would never give birth without the midwife. And the religious rituals and magic spells and things like that taking place. Whereas these Hebrew women, they're producing these numerous children. They're multiplying rapidly, and they're becoming very strong. Pharaoh and the Egyptians are terrified of these Hebrews. And yet they're having these children without any help. Okay, no midwife, no magic spells. It's just God blessing. He's multiplying. He's being fruitful and multiplying. And these Hebrews are scattering across the face of the land. Well, this is Genesis 3 revisited. The story is recapitulating. And in fact, that's what God is doing here. Through the Hebrew nation, God is going to bless all nations. And so in order for him to do that, he has to deliver his people. All right. So again, there's a profound theological truth hidden in this wordplay. And then one other note here. So how would I translate it? Again, in my translation, maybe on my main line, because this is how the story is playing out, I would make my primary translation, they are like animals, but then I would do something like put a footnote there, and then render it down in the footnotes. Another way to read this phrase is for they are lively or for they are animals. That way the reader can understand that there's a double entendre, as well as it would help the English reader to interpret the passage better. And then just for fun, I made another note here because there's a little bit of irony going on in verses 21 and 22. Because the midwives feared God, literally he also fashioned houses for them, or he made families or dynasties for them. Well, Pharaoh is a title, and the title literally means the great house. All right, so we never get Pharaoh's name. We don't know which Pharaoh this was for sure. There's a lot of guesses out there, but he never gets named. But we know the names of these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and their name endures forever. All right, so that's a bit of a turnabout there going on in the text. So I would put that in the footnotes as well. All right, so what to do when things appear to get lost in translation? Well, number one, just keep in mind that at times this happens. The Hebrew and Greek passages of Scripture do contain double entendre. There's double meaning at times. The biblical authors did employ it. The only way you're going to know that is to maybe do some deep dives into the word studies. You're reading slowly, reading carefully. But again, this is where the commentaries are very, very useful. We do not want to ignore the 2,000 plus years of study, biblical study by the experts, what Martin Luther called the doctors of the church. We do rely on their expertise that's been passed down to us through the ages. Very, very important. And so, you look to the commentaries, your pastor, as well as the scholars. And the more literal the translation, the better. Ironically, there is a Bible out there called the Amplified Bible, where if they don't like to settle on a single meaning for a word, they just put the whole range of meanings. Thus, they amplify it. It's not a great reading Bible, but it does maybe highlight those passages of Scripture where more than one possible meaning for a word or a phrase might actually be appropriate for that particular context. So the Amplified Bible might be another study tool for you to recognize issues like Exodus 1:19. Okay, well, I thought that would help. It gives the rest of the story there, and I think this is why we can see that this is the turning point in this particular account, because this is where the Hebrew the midwives foil Pharaoh. They speak to his prejudice, and not only do they save the boys, but they save themselves, at least temporarily. Very, very interesting passage in many, many ways. Great stuff. Thanks for tuning in.